All right, I am back. Mr. Jackson, Bug Guy, is back again. And for this video, we're going to talk about some seashells. And we're going to talk about the type of animals that lived in the seashells. And at the end of the program, I did send some seashells over your way. So hopefully you'll get to take some seashells home with you also. So the first one I want to talk about, this is a really big type of a snail. And this is the Oregon State mollusk. This is called the hairy whelk, and it's a great big version of a snail. And the weird thing about this, when it's alive, it looks like it's covered with a thick brown coating of hair. And people actually eat that snail. Would you ever eat a snail? Sounds kind of weird, but there's a lot of meat that comes from the inside of that snail. And seashells, they're the home of the animal. There used to be an animal that lived inside there, and the animal, it actually secretes. It kind of oozes this compound chemical out of its body, and it's called calcium. And I know you guys have had a glass of milk at some point in your life. Calcium is in your milk, and your bones are made out of calcium too. And that's the same material that the seashells are made out of, but they have a way of oozing that material out of their body to make themselves a home. It's kind of like a little camper shell. So that's called the hairy whelk. That is the Oregon State snail, the Oregon State mollusk. The next one over here, this is one that you see at the ocean quite often. These are called barnacles. And barnacles are made out of calcium also. And right in the middle right there, that's where the live animal would have been living. And barnacles, they usually attach to something that doesn't move a whole lot, like a boat or a rock underwater, or sometimes they will actually grow on the side of the body of a whale also. But barnacles, they filter little tiny bits of food that's flowing through the water. That's how they eat. But after the animal dies, the seashell portion of it, the outer calcium portion, it stays behind, and then it gets broken off, and you can find them on the seashore also. But that's our friend the barnacle. The next one here, these are pretty common. A lot of people go clamming. This is called a butter clam, and usually it's two parts, and both parts look exactly the same. And the body of the clam, it lives inside. And if you've ever been to the ocean before, sometimes you're digging in the sand, making a sand castle, and you can uncover clams like that. And you dig them out of the sand, and you take them home, and you throw them in a big bucket of boiling water, and then eventually you can crack open the shells, and you can eat the clams out of the inside. Maybe you've heard of Mom and Dad eating something called clam chowder before. That's where clam chowder comes from, the inside of the clam shells. Pretty tasty too. Another one that you find at the Oregon coast growing on the rocks, these are called limpets. Limpets. And when this is alive, it actually glues itself right onto the face of the rock, and there's a hole that comes out of the top right there. This is called a keyhole limpet. And when it's alive, it sends up these little tiny mouth parts, and it kind of looks like feathers that come out of the top of that hole, and they grab food out of the water when the rock is submerged underneath the ocean, and that's how they feed themselves. But then eventually the sun will come out when the tide is low and the water is way down here, and the poor limpets, they dry out and they wind up dying, and after they die, they leave behind their very cool shells. That's called a limpet, keyhole limpet shell. Pretty cute too. Another thing that you find washed up on the beaches quite often, this is called coral. Now coral, this used to be a living animal, and they live on the bottom of the ocean. Maybe you've heard of a coral reef before. Coral reef is kind of like an underwater mountain range that's made out of the bodies of these little animals. And as they die off, pardon me, as they die off, the coral, it will eventually break off, and it gets washed out onto the beach, and then you can collect them when you're picking up seashells too. But this is a body of a dead piece of coral. You find them all over the Oregon beaches too. Another one that you find if you've ever been exploring tide pools at the ocean with Mom and Dad, These are pretty common. This is called a snail. It's called a turban snail. And they're bright purple in color. And if you've ever seen them walking around underwater, it looks like their legs are sticking out of that little shell. They go cruising across the bottom of the tide pools. But again, when they die, you can collect their shells and you can take them home with you too. Pretty cute. Purple turban shell snails. Another one that you find, another type of snail washed up on the beach quite often. These are a different type of turban snail, but they have a different shell entirely. Very cute little shell. And the snail that used to live right inside there, and the snail made this shell. Sometimes the shell, it washes back and forth with the tide as the tide is moving in and out, and it will break the shell open, and you can see the inside of the shell. So this is the full shell right here. That is what the inside of the shell would have looked like. Amazing, isn't it? Another one that you find out in the deeper water, this is called a sea urchin. And when a sea urchin is alive, it looks like it's covered with bright purple needles sticking out the top of their body. And these guys, they actually submerge themselves down into a little crevice in a rock, and that's to prevent themselves from being washed away by the tide. But you'll notice right up here, there is a hole, and on the bottom of the shell, that's where his mouth is. And when this animal is alive, it's got a razor-sharp beak, kind of like a bird's beak underneath the body. And they use that beak for chewing on seaweed and kelp and algae. So a couple of good reasons not to try to pick up a sea urchin when it's alive. It's got very sharp, pokey spines, and it might stab you in the hand. But if you do manage to pull it out of a rock, don't put it in the palm of your hand, because that bird beak underneath, it might bite you and hurt you. Okay? But that's our friend, the sea urchin. All right, here's another animal, and this is called the sand dollar. And sometimes when they're dead, you find them washed up on the beach, and they're really beautiful shells. On the front pattern here, it's got 5 little legs, and on the back, it's got a hole. And that's the animal's mouth. And when the sand dollar is alive out in the open ocean, it looks like it's covered with little tiny brown hairs. And when they're alive, they always set themselves upright in the sand, like so. And they let that water flowing through the ocean, it brings little tiny microscopic food around to the back of their body. And they use those little hairs to move that hair, or move that food out of the water into their mouth. That's how they eat. But once they die, they wash up on the beach and they get bleached in the sun, and they're big, beautiful sand dollars. Pretty neat looking animal too. And then the last one on the table over here, this is one that everybody knows. It's a sea star. Pretty common animal. In Oregon, they come in a lot of different colors. Sometimes they have 5 legs. Sometimes they have 22 legs. It all depends on the species of sea star. But sea stars are really neat animals for a couple of reasons. Number one, if they lose a leg, if something were to bite off a leg, or if it's damaged in any way, it's no big deal, because the sea star has the ability to grow back a brand new leg, which is a pretty good trick too. So there's a lot of really neat animals that live along the Oregon beaches, and after they die, they leave their seashells behind for you and I to collect. All right, we'll see you next trip.